so I ended up with kind of two clusters of articles. One cluster traces the origins of the LGBT movement or the modern movement, let's say, essentially back to Germany when, and maybe to Europe more broadly. And that can go back to the 18th century. And so the very first article actually is set in the 18th century. And then the second big cluster, which is also maybe a debate,
Hmm.
has gone on sort of between the US East Coast and West Coast because New York and Stonewall have stolen all the thunder, as we know.
Hmm.
But a very good argument can be made that there was activity on the West Coast long before Stonewall.
Welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, an arts and culture podcast. I'm Dr. Andrew Rimby, the host and founder. Wherever you are listening, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, please do me a favor, make sure you're following the show and make sure that you rate and review us. It really means a lot, and it continues to allow me to get really exciting guests for the podcast and to continue delivering the podcast for free. Remember, though, we do have a Patreon, so if you don't want to listen to ads and you want to watch the video episodes of the podcast, patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Do you know that there is a book club? It's free and virtual. So easy to just join the book club in your pajamas on a Sunday afternoon. Our next book club is June 22nd at 5 p.m. We are reading Sophie Gilbert's Girl on Girl: How Pop Culture Turned a Generation of Women Against Themselves. She writes for The Atlantic. She is such an amazing pop culture expert. So if you've always wondered, wait, why did the paparazzi harass Britney Spears like that? Or did the Spice Girls really have a love-hate relationship with each other? You're going to want to read this book. So to join the book club, email ivorytowerboilerroom@gmail.com and I will give you the Zoom link, June 22nd, 5 p.m. Without further ado, oh, and a brief message of thanks. Thank you to Mary DiPipi, the chief contributor, and Christian Garcia, who edits this podcast, and my fiance and parents, who continue delivering really creative ideas my way. And without further ado, here's today's episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and I hope you all are enjoying the spring season and the warm weather that's now here on the East Coast, at least, where my guest is coming from and I'm, recording from. So, welcome to the program, Richard Schneider, editor-in-chief, founder, all things Gay and Lesbian Review magazine, to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Yes, it's the Gay and Lesbian Review, which we now call the G&LR, because we have a terribly old-fashioned name, which we struggle with. And so we try to, like, I don't know, like the NAACP, we've kind of just switched to letters. So we're the
You got your
G&LR.
acronym, exactly.
Yeah,
So,
wonderful.
I know last time you were on, it was so fun chatting about like deep diving into the history of the GNLR, your affiliation, how all of that started. But I think, which kind of ties well to the March and April, was an encore special issue called When Did the LGBT Movement Begin? Which is such an interesting question with so many different theories and angles. So I'm just curious, like, what for you sparked the idea of let's return to this age-old question in LGBTQ circles?
Oh, well, the immediate spark was that my husband Stephen and I were traveling to Africa for a couple of weeks at the end of January. So I had to pull back the issue. I didn't have much time to create this issue. So I said, what can I do? What can I do to save some time? How about a best of? Because it's been a long time since I've done that before. And everybody does that. And I thought, actually, I think it turned out really well. So I decided to do something historical
Mm.
and raise this very fundamental question, like what was the spark that got the movement going? Because everybody assumes that Stonewall was the big turning point. We go back to the summer of 1969, late June to be exact, and I'm okay with that. I think that's a fine dividing point, and I'm glad that we have a sort of symbolic beginning, like the Big Bang that sort of began everything. But of course, there really was a lot of activity long before that, and there's been some debate, and some people who say no, it wasn't just Stonewall. Didn't suddenly the LGBT movement didn't come out of nothing and suddenly burst forth fully armed like Athena from Zeus's head. Instead, it had we have a history, a long history. And so the idea was to go back and dig out some articles from past issues that would make that point and explore that question. And I think and so it's the articles that I chose add up to, I think, a total of 8, of which one, the last one, is about Stonewall, and the preceding 7 are about earlier movements, earlier efforts, earlier moments in history or episodes when it seemed that things could happen. It seemed the moment might have arrived, but it didn't quite. And so there wasn't an LGBT movement at that time. But uh, looking back in history, we say, well, it could have happened, but it didn't. So I set this up chronologically. You've kindly held the issue up, and so you can see it. To me, it's backwards. But I know to you, it's there. There's yours. And so I started chronologically, and that's probably how it would make sense for us to proceed.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And it's such an interesting question because I feel that there's always these um especially in academic circles, the are you going to point to the ancient period? Like, were the ancient Greeks actually gay, even though we're using the term ahistorically, since a gay identity is such a um, industrial a la Oscar Wilde and his whole trial type of conception. So, like, where do you even weigh in, Richard, on when you founded the Gay and Lesbian Review and it comes out of Harvard, which, Harvard being all in the news right now, which you don't have to weigh in on that. But I think that something I'm curious about is, did you feel, even when you founded the Gay and Lesbian Review, that there was a lot of different conversations going on from an academic vantage point of gay arts and culture to a public discussion of gay arts and culture? Like, do you feel that these worlds were far apart, or were they really interconnected, if that makes sense? Like the highbrow, lowbrow connection.
Oh, well, I don't know about the highbrow, lowbrow. I mean, I think it was more the way it shook out. It was more a question of East Coast versus West Coast,
Hmm.
and then it was a question of U.S. versus the world. And going back to the 1950s, Stonewall, of course, was 1969. Even actually going back to the 1940s,
Hmm.
and so there's a bunch of well, a bunch, there's 2 or 3 articles that focus on kind of the West Coast and what was happening there. And then there are 2 or 3 articles that focus on essentially Germany, because there really was a lot of activity in Germany. Um,
Well, and I never have asked you this question. It's something, the more I've nicely been so cozy and cuddly with your magazine, and its aesthetic, is how has the question about how a writer for you approaches even the nomenclature, like, say they aren't comfortable using the nomenclature of LGBTQ, maybe it's for um political reasons, maybe it's they think it's so connected to a Western idea of imperialism, or even it could be religious purposes. I don't know, right? Anything on the table there. Do you feel that that has ever been something you've had to reflect on yourself, is how LGBTQ itself is such a Western, very American type of naming system?
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that we confront all the time. We know that the term gay really didn't come into widespread use until the 1960s, and the concept of a gay identity
Mm.
probably can be traced back to the late 19th century, but the nomenclature was completely different. In fact, we might get into the fact that in the late 19th century, the people who first sort of identified homosexuals as like a certain a class or a category of people used the term Urnings, Germans, or Uranians.
Mm.
And so that was the term. And then inverts was big in the early 20th century. All the Freudians and everybody said inverts. And of course, there were even meaner words, nastier words that go back further in time. But we know that the concept of a gay identity, as we understand it, is really a very recent concept. And yet, I am of the belief that the the underlying reality of same sex attraction and indeed same sex activity can be traced much farther back than the use of these terms or the experience of what we call a gay identity. So, what do we do with that? Well, I've certainly been cautious about using the term gay, let's say, or lesbian for that matter, to refer to people, from centuries ago or even from maybe 60 or 100 years ago,
Mm.
um, unless we sort of make sure that we've included enough caveats to get away with that usage and people understand that we really know that those terms are modern and that people didn't actually have that precise identity. But nevertheless, that's where the word queer, which I don't particularly love the word queer because I'm of a generation where it was a pejorative term and it was kind of a mean term. But I've come around to believing that the term queer is actually very useful, certainly in talking about historical figures. You could talk about somebody like Lord Byron.
Mm.
Well, Lord Byron certainly wasn't gay in any sense. I mean, we can't possibly say, he had a gay identity. In fact, he was kind of a womanizer in many
Yeah.
ways, but he was really just a very sexual person. And there was something queer about him. I mean, he was just sexually, he was a bit kinky and he liked younger people and he
Mm.
liked not so young people and he liked women, he liked men. So I ended up with kind of two clusters of articles. One cluster traces the origins of the LGBT movement or the modern movement, let's say, essentially back to Germany when, and maybe to Europe more broadly. And that can go back to the 18th century. And so the very first article actually is set in the 18th century. And then the second big cluster, which is also maybe a debate,
Mm.
has gone on sort of between the US East Coast and West Coast because New York and Stonewall have stolen all the thunder, as we know.
Mm.
But a very good argument can be made that there was activity on the West Coast long before Stonewall. He was queer in some way. So I've come around to believing that that word is actually quite useful when we don't really know. And if we want to assign a word that clearly Byron didn't use that word either, and we know perfectly well that's our word, but we just know there's something in the other sense of the term, let's say. The word queer is good because it means different, unusual,
Mm.
strange. And
Yeah.
that would certainly
Eccentric.
apply to
Campy.
eccentric,
Yeah.
yes. Um, and that would certainly apply to Byron and to many, many other people. In fact, I would say probably in the magazine, there is of more articles of that sort than of just about any other, namely articles where we are going back in time and we're discovering that, Emily Dickinson probably deep down was a lesbian and Virginia Woolf maybe too, even though Virginia Woolf was married to a man and Emily Dickinson was seemingly celibate or didn't have much of who knows. We really don't know very much about her private life and her sex life, certainly. Um, so, the term I think is useful, or it's useful for us to have a term and to have a way of talking about those people that we kind of recognize as one of us. So I guess that's kind of a long answer to your
No,
question.
it's incredible, Richard. I feel like it's so interesting because as someone who studied queer studies and how did this discipline get formed and all the tensions that existed with Judith Butler and with David
Steve,
Halperin, the 100
Steve
Years of
Sedgwick,
Homosexuality.
yeah,
Yeah,
right.
that
David Halpern, right? He was an early inspiration in a way for me. I knew him way back in the '80s,
mm, okay.
yeah,
So, what's interesting is their work really charted that whole, like you were saying, okay, is there going to be a psychoanalytic way that we're going to try to recover an author's gay identity? Like, right? But now it's kind of switched from identity to, okay, what's a queer aesthetic? And that's kind of like what you're saying. What I love about the magazine is I just saw Death Becomes Her, the musical, and I have so many nice things to say about it. It was so enjoyable and campy. And there's like a whole song called For the Gaze, Gaze, and it's just this great double entendre that
yeah,
I've even used with my students to look at figurative language. And um, right, that is so queer coded, even though Madeline Ashton is not a lesbian or
yeah.
bisexual, but yet her fan base are campy gays. I was recently watching Return to Oz and Nosferatu with my fiance, and I thought, wait, I just had on Broadview Press authors who wrote a vampire literature anthology and the iconic edition of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So I said to my fiance, you know what? I need to tell everyone who's listening to ITBR that BroadviewPress.com has everything from classic novels to discussions about vampire literature, vampires in film and TV, the philosophy of sports, Native American culture, horror. There is so much on Broadview Press's website. I urge you all right now, search broadviewpress.com. You will see that not only do they have books for college instructors, which if you do teach college, you better add them to your list because it's amazing, all the resources they have. But if you have just wandered around a bookstore or a library and thought, everyone always told me to read Moby Dick, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to fully understand it. Broadviewpress.com has you covered because they have amazing notes and sources to help you dissect that huge whale of a tale. See what I did there? I was just watching the Page Master, so there's a little Moby Dick reference. Head to broadviewpress.com, use the exclusive code they gave us, Ivory Tower, 20% off your entire order. Yes, your entire order. Enjoy your reading, and please reach out to me and let me know what you're reading from Broadview Press. I would love to share it on social media. So I think that's so interesting because there's so much in our culture, frat boys, or there's a song on TikTok right now called I want to see my friends' dicks out at the bar, written by a straight man. And straight, I'm putting that in quotes. But right, even that has so much potential for an analysis. So is that for you what begins a good topic is just how does the author understand the aesthetic about what they're writing about? How is it being queered in a way? Like you said, how are they
Um,
processing it?
I would say sometimes. I mean, uh, the art this issue is mostly historical, and it's mostly so people have made all kinds of inferences in order to go back to 19th century Germany and early 20th
Yeah,
century
so let's
Germany.
start there. What's going
Uh,
on in 19th century Germany?
Oh, okay. Well, let's start with
Yeah.
if you want to start with the very first article, it actually is an 18th century Germany. It's a piece by David Tasium. I'm going to flip through my issue a little bit occasionally to just cheat a little bit. Um, with So this article is called "Warm Brothers in 18th Century Berlin," and
Mm.
it turns out that I mean you could make an argument that really the modern LGBT rights movement starts in the Enlightenment. It starts in the 18th century.
Mm.
Voltaire, Goethe were both very interested in this topic. They both talked about it, as did the encyclopedists and quite a few others. So this is kind of exemplary, maybe the best case that we have for a kind of society, not just individuals who are sort of abstractly wondering about sexual identities and variations. Instead, we have here an individual who's talking about a kind of society which was in Germany, in Berlin,
Mm.
and they referred to themselves as warm brothers, warme Brüder. And the warme Brüder were warm brothers who wrote letters to each other and communicated and corresponded and apparently got together and probably had sex. I guess we can infer that or imagine is the case. And it's one thing that's very interesting. So these letters, there are these letters that are written by an Austrian officer in which he's describing this little underground society in Berlin that he knows all about. And he describes it in disapproving terms, like he seems to have to condemn it. But you really wonder, like, it almost seems as though he has to describe it that way in order to get away with writing about it,
Mm.
because he seems to make pay visits to these folks, to these individuals, and describe their activities somewhat negatively. But then he goes back and visits them again.
Mm.
So so there's that, and so it starts in the 18th century, late 18th century, with the Enlightenment, and with this one particular German officer, or Austrian actually, um, who's writing about this society of warm brothers.
Mm.
And then there's a gap, and we zoom ahead, but we're still in Germany,
Oh, wait,
and
sorry. One question, Richard, is
yeah,
how closely does the Warm Brothers connect to, say, the French libertines, like the Marquis de Sade? Like, is there any through line there?
they knew there was. I think they there was a general awareness among people like that of each other, and everybody corresponded. Of course, everything was in writing. These letters, you didn't pick the telephone or text people in those days. Everything is nicely recorded in letters,
Mm.
and that's how we know that people like Voltaire and Goethe, I mentioned, and various others were interested in this and interested in each other, and they spoke with each other, and they talked about this. So, yeah, the French libertines, and then Marquis de Sade might be off on his own. I don't know, actually. I think he was kind of quite. He talk about a queer, talk about a person who was, for
Oh,
whom the word queer was kind of invented.
yes.
Uh,
100 Days of Sodom is a trip.
yeah, right. And the
Such
philosophy
a
of
so interesting.
of the bedroom also.
Oh, yeah, BDSM culture that
Yeah. Oh
we
yeah.
can throw give homage to the Marquis de Sade. Okay, as you're saying, so then there's like a gap that happens
So
with the
then there's a
next article.
gap in the sense that, I mean, then you get into the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and Germany is and is completely disunified, and the rest of Europe is in chaos for a while. But somewhere along the 19th century, um, you get, not out of the blue, but almost out of the blue, this guy Bert Kerbani. I never can say his name, but I guess it's pronounced Kerbani. Carl Maria Kerbani invents the word homosexual, in a letter. And in this next issue, actually, there is a little facsimile of the letter in which it first appeared.
Mm.
And you can see it's all written in German, and um, it has been nicely highlighted so that we can see here is the moment when seemingly that word was used for the first time. And he was writing to Hirschfeld, or actually he was writing to Ulrichs. Magnus Hirschfeld came a little bit later, but Ulrichs
Mm.
was also one of the early sexologists who initially developed some of these ideas. And they picked up the word homosexual. It was just used sort of casually in this letter, and everybody started to use it. And so the word um, became, at least among certain scholars and psychologists, it was the days of the early The early psychologists started to use this expression. And then, of course, Foucault is the one who came and said that the use of the word homosexual was critical because before there was activity people would talk about. They could talk about sodomy, they could talk about they could talk about pederasty or any number of things. But with the word homosexual, you maybe just add an S to it, and you suddenly have homosexuals. You have a class of people. You have a type of person who is a homosexual. And so Foucault is the one who really gave us this idea that the homosexual was invented or
Yeah.
socially constructed
Yeah, he says
rather
that
than
homosexual was now a
it was
species.
now a
History of
species. It was
sexuality.
in that very famous quotation. Um, and so it was in that era that all of this is happening. And it was in that era that I mentioned, I mentioned Ulrichs and especially Magnus Hirschfeld.
Mm.
And Magnus Hirschfeld was really critical. This article is called "The House That Hirschfeld Built,"
Mm.
and and specifically the house that he built was a society that set up. Let me get the right date. 1897 is when the Scientific Humanitarian Committee was founded, and that became a very key organization or institution in Berlin that lasted until the Nazis came along in 1933. So it had a good, 36-year run. And during that period, it was a meeting place, it was a center, it was a seat of advocacy. They were very self consciously uh, advocating the liberation of sexuality, the repeal of the notorious what was it the bill number 375 I think in Germany, 175 section 175 in Germany, which was the law that was used for so many years to repress and imprison gay people.
Mm.
And so they fought against that. Hirschfeld wrote many books. He gathered a group of people around him, some of them quite famous. People like W.H. Auden, for example, and various others. I mean, Isherwood, who was in Berlin. And I should mention this was all happening in Berlin. Came and went, and they hung out at this institute for various periods of time. And it was a big thing, and it was now. And you could easily look back and say, you know what, that really should have been kind of the Stonewall. That should have been the what launched a
Mhm.
worldwide or at least a Western-wide LGBT movement. But of course, the Nazis came along in the 1930s and put an end to it. And it's tragic because Hirschfeld had accumulated a mass of materials on sexuality, historical materials, and thousands of books and objects that were part of his collection, and they were all destroyed and burned by the Nazis.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and Christopher Isherwood documents this in his fictional book Goodbye Berlin, which then becomes the cabaret play and then the musical. Uh,
right,
right,
yeah,
because cabaret is that decadent, sexual, libertine burlesque, and then all of a sudden you see what happens when the Weimar Republic represses sexual
right,
identity and then, you know, criminalizes and even moves it to a genocidal state, which, is unfortunately
yeah,
like a backlash we're seeing now from rights being granted, and then there's the pendulum swinging of, oh, maybe we should usher in authoritarian policies. And
right. And so it
yeah,
was not just a sudden burst of liberation in the 1920s to only to be destroyed by in the that during the Weimar period, as you mentioned, only to be destroyed in the 1930s and reversed and turned into the worst kind of oppression. Um, yeah, that that's that's what happened.
but I feel like these issues, like these articles really do show how it's not like progress has been made right now, right? Like I think there is a certain generational belief, and maybe that'll tie into another article you think that the younger generation especially would benefit from, because these societies, um, this kind of allyship and political activism isn't new. And I think sometimes there's like a retelling of those who've only attended pride parades, like, oh, this has existed, like this kind of intersectional, like the public receiving us in New York City has always existed. But it's like, no, there's always been political movements. It's just never at that commercial stage. Like, right, we're kind of in a gay commercial appeal where brands want to show their allyship. I mean, we'll see what happens this
Well, they
pride.
did at
But
least. I mean, I hope that that continues. I mean,
yeah,
it's just kind of scary. We don't know like how far this thing is going to go.
yeah.
But it's what the parallels really are quite shocking and quite surprising. Really, I mean, I've always felt that there's probably something like 35% or 30% of a third of people are basically fascists. My doctorate is in sociology, and I did a lot of my work on the so-called authoritarian personality, which came out of World War II, and some of the Jewish survivors, like Adorno and Horkheimer, who identified this. I don't know if they said specifically that it's a third of the people, or if they came up with a percentage, but they said there is a core of people that, for whatever reason, in every society, seem to have these authoritarian feelings, and every once in a while they come to the fore, and they're not usually a majority, but somehow they get power. And I think that's what happened with the Nazis. The Nazis were not a majority; they seized power, and the same is true of Trump. I mean, he's not. I don't think these people, the MAGA people, are a majority by any means, but they're a very determined minority, and they've used every trick in the book, and they've gotten into power.
Mm,
And so we're going to have to deal with that in very much the same way. I'm not maybe not ultimately in the same way as the Germans did, because that was pretty apocalyptic. Let's hope that we can get out of this thing a little bit more gracefully.
yeah.
But we don't know.
Well,
This,
I think it's awakening, if anything, it's awakening people who didn't think that they were activist minded to realize that now is the time. If you need to speak out for um, migrants or those who are seen as undocumented or Black rights, Jewish, Muslim rights, like that it's not just about necessarily being gay. It's about how does being gay, like if you have certain privileges, I can speak as a white man who's gay, right? If we have certain privileges in one way, maybe we should be using our voice to help advocate for those of other marginalized identities. Like we need to be together, right? Like you kind of have to come together in this moment because if not, um, your rights are going to be attacked eventually.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's that poem was like, first they came for the communists, then they came for the labor unionists, and then they came for me.
Yeah.
And so I think there's that feeling that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, apparently there was like a shift in the last election such that many, like Hispanic voters, for example, voted for Trump. I think maybe now some of them are having buyer's remorse. I think they're coming to realize as we recognize it, the so-called oppressed minorities, people who are not like white Anglo-Saxon men, which is the vast majority of our country, are going to realize, we're kind of in this together, and these MAGA people are coming after all of us. So it's time for us to reunite and fight back. So
Yeah,
I
maybe
feel
we were
like something like
sold
that will happen.
yeah, we were sold a Carnival Barker's bill of goods that
Yeah,
um, was all just to help his own class and cut out those who aren't part of this elite society. Or not even elite society, but just control the means of power. And I think
or
that you're right.
yeah,
There are people waking up to that, and it's important to um, the speaking out is necessary. So I appreciate you going with me. Well, to talk about another, I mean, is there anything you're seeing with what Will Roscoe does with the 1950s? Because I feel like there is something with the Mattachine Society that lends a little, not a little, but lends a lot of contemporary
yeah. I mean,
perspective.
so just to catch you up, and I'll go into Roscoe's article. There are a couple of other articles along the way that offer maybe additional
Mhm.
sort of contenders for like what could be viewed as the origins of the LGBT movement, um, and maybe your listeners can take a look at the issue, and
Yes.
you'll probably give them information about how they can find it online or something.
Yeah,
Because
glreview.org.
yes, thank you.
Yes.
glreview.org. Come to our website, subscribe, get the digital edition or the hard copy edition. Either one would be great. And you'll see that there are other articles, and there are a couple of things along the way, and centering again on Germany. Although there is one that talks about a society in England, right around the time of Oscar Wilde, and people who kind of knew Oscar Wilde.
Summer's almost here, and as a lover of literature, bookstores, libraries, the constant question I get is, Andrew, what book should I add to my summer reading list and read at the beach this summer? And I just always had a problem trying to tell people what to read. But guess what? No more. I have a magazine that has become my best friend. It is the G&LR, the Gay and Lesbian Review, a bi-monthly magazine of all things LGBTQ arts and culture. Their current issue is called The First Homosexuals, and it is guest edited by Dr. Jonathan D. Katz, who is a professor at the University of Penn. He was the founding president of New York's Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art, which, if you've never been there, is a free museum. So definitely go there. It's in Soho and it's amazing. Back to the GNLR. This new edition is so exciting to read. It looks at how the term homosexuality is an invented term. It was invented by medical scientists in the late Victorian period. So I can't wait to read all of these articles, but there's articles talking about homosexuality in Japan, Russia, Canada, Paris, India, Argentina. And Jonathan D. Katz talks about his exhibition called The First Homosexuals, now on display in Chicago's Wrightwood Museum from May 2nd to July 26th. But I can't get to Chicago this summer, so I'm so happy that I get to look through the magazine and see all of the articles that Jonathan has put together with contributing writers. I'm interviewing Jonathan soon, so look out for that episode, everyone. The GNLR has given me an exclusive promo code. Write it down, everyone. It's ITBR Choice, and you get a free issue with your subscription. So, glreview.org, go to the subscribe section, ITBR Choice, you get a free issue, and I can't wait for you all to enjoy the GNLR as much as I do. Please let me know if you're reading the GNLR, and until next time when I have Jonathan D. Katz on.
Which might also have been kind of a contender in the English-speaking world too.
Is this Rebecca Batley's one
yes,
on George
Batley's argument.
Cecil
Yeah,
Lives? Okay.
which is that the Order of Kyria, which well, I'm not sure, or Chironia, sorry, the Order of Chironia. I'm never sure how to pronounce that, but it was George Cecil Ives was kind of the ringleader in that case in the 1890s, and it went on for a few decades after that, or at least a couple decades. I don't think it lasted all that long. This probably ended by around World War One. So it had a life, and it had quite a few members, quite a few probably educated British men who were part of this secret, but it was kind of a secret organization. And it had secret codes and symbolism and all that sort of thing. I'm just doing this for Gretel likes to. Stephen just went out, and our dog likes him to. So he waves when he walks by, and she wants to see that.
Aww.
So anyway, but zooming back, so that's Germany. That's Europe. Back in the U.S., you mentioned Will Roscoe's article. He talks a lot about the beginnings of the Mattachine Society, and that's kind of where it all starts in the U.S. And that takes us up to the 1940s. And the figure there is Harry Hay, perhaps the most famous, although there were a number of others who were his sidekicks and allies. And Harry Hay was based in Los Angeles, and this is where the argument comes in. The case is made for Los Angeles or the West Coast as the true origin of the modern LGBT movement.
Mm.
It was Harry Hay, who was an avowed communist. He was a figure from the left. He was a political activist who was gay, and uh, Roscoe points out that there were other people who were gay, like and who had written sort of gay novels. Like you mentioned Isherwood a moment ago, and Gore Vidal was around at that time, and W.H. Auden had written some gay poetry. So, and there was a consciousness and awareness that there were some people who were not straight.
Mm.
Um, and so Roscoe says in a kind of humorous way, yeah, they all had great ideas, but uh, Harry Hay did something that no one else had done. He called a meeting. And that meeting took place, I think, in 1946, as far back as 1946. They met in somebody's living room, probably Harry's, and they decided that they were going to set up an organization, and they called it the Mattachine Society. Soon after that, some women uh, in San Francisco set up the Daughters of Bilitis, which was kind of a women's counterpart. Both organizations, the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis, actually spread far and wide. They had chapters in many cities, including on the East and West coasts, and they had meetings. They had political advocacy. They had legal cases. There was an important victory in the 1950s involving the use of the U.S. mail to send gay materials, and the Mattachine Society won at the Supreme Court level and was given the go-ahead to mail their magazine, which was called One,
Mm.
across the country. And
Wait, is
the
this where the One Institute gets
yeah,
their
that's where they get their
founding
name from.
story?
That's
Oh,
that's
okay.
the One Institute because it was called One. Sometimes it hadn't. Sometimes it was all in caps. Um, and the Daughters of Bilitis had a magazine called The Ladder, and both of them had hundreds to thousands of subscribers across the
Wow.
country. And they were unlike. I mean, they weren't like the G&LR, which is very well produced and fairly slick, and it looks like a modern magazine. It was kind of like these early magazines were kind of handmade, and they were full of letters. Like I get a few letters, over a 2 month cycle. But usually, if somebody's strongly objects to some point that was made, historical accuracy or whatever, but what they were filled with were letters from people who told their story. And they would get hundreds and hundreds of letters of people say, "Oh, thank you for existing. I thought I was complete." They come from Kansas. They would come from Ohio, from rural places where people said, "I thought I was the only one."
Oh, so it's
But
kind of like
somehow,
your Here's My Story on the glreview.org
yeah,
in a
now,
way.
yeah, now that's the sort of legacy of people who tell their story, and so, maybe things haven't changed all that much because many of the stories in Here's My Story column, which is part of our blog, are very much the same situation of being raised in rural Nebraska and um, having it tough because you were from an evangelical family and you came out and it was difficult and it was contentious and
Mm.
but it all turned out okay usually. um, and here I am writing my story.
Mm. Mm.
So the people who write to us are probably people for whom it did come out okay because in fact they are writing their story. People who
Mm.
didn't successfully come out or something bad happened, we don't know what happened to
Well,
them.
and they can be part of this community. I think that's something that, um, Will Roscoe's article really brings to bear, or even Eve Goldberg. I mean, I don't know. Did you want to say anything about John D'Amelio's article, or?
I think D'Amelio's article is really important. We might be kind of running long, and so I'll try to be brief. But
Yeah, of course.
D'Amelio talks about one particular individual, Frank Camedy, who
Mm.
was actually a member of the Mattachine Society in Washington, D.C. And his big innovation was to take it. I should mention
Yeah.
that the Mattachine Society was very secretive. It was basically still a secret society. There were no public press releases. There were no public demonstrations. Um, Kameny's innovation was to actually use the Mattachine Society of Washington as a base for uh, staging protests in places like uh, the Capitol in Washington or Independence Hall in Philadelphia. In fact, so for all through the 1960s, he had an annual demonstration at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And so there's a great big picture in this article of Frank and his gang um, dressed in suits, carrying signs, walking around in a very orderly circle in front of Independence Hall on the 4th of July.
Hmm.
That's what they did. And so um, D'Amelio makes, I think, a creditable argument that um, Kameny really was, if not sort of the founder of the gay movement. In fact, he backs off from it. Says, no, I'm not really saying that, but I'm saying that he did something that was critical. A critical piece of the gay movement was public protests and demonstrations, and getting out there, not just being a secret society like all the ones we've talked about so far. Certainly in this country, like Mattachine and the Daughters of Bilitis were essentially secret societies. So you disguised your name. People didn't use their own names typically, for example. So Kameny said, no, we're going to use our own names. We're going to be out there. We're going to hold signs. We're going to protest. We're going to demonstrate. That was taken a step further. And I think this would be maybe a good place to stop, because we get right up to 1967, 2 years before Stonewall, which is when we're back on the West Coast. We're back in Los Angeles, and something called the Black Cat protests. On New Year's Eve, actually, it would be 1966, because it's always a little, is it 66 or 67? But it was like pretty much the stroke of midnight. Is when there was a sudden police raid. All of these undercover police at the Black Cat, which was a bar in the Silver Lake district of Los Angeles, suddenly mobilized and started bashing people's heads and arresting people on New Year's Eve of 1966-67. It's not so much that they fought back. So it's not like Stonewall in the sense that there was a riot. There were a lot of arrests, but there were a lot of people who were really pissed about this situation. They said, oh, come on. Because these were bars that were fairly well established. The article, Goldberg's article, makes the point that there were maybe 100 bars in LA. It's not like the Black Cat was not so unique. There were a lot of gay bars. They were maybe more or less secretive, or you kind of had to know that they were there. But that was the point at which a group of people in LA said, okay, no more Mr. Secret Guy. We, like Kameny, are going to come out publicly and make it have a demonstration. And so they did. It was a citywide LA demonstration. The one in Silver Lake was by far the largest, but they got like thousands of people, at least maybe hundreds. I don't know the exact number, but it was a significant number of people to show up and carry signs and protest. None of the signs said anything about gay or homosexual, but they were at least clear enough about their intentions. And they were fighting this police raid and saying, stop doing this. We have a right to exist, basically.
Mm.
That was the first time that the word pride was used. They didn't use the word gay, they used the word pride. That was the first use of that word, which we still use today.
Mm.
And it was the beginning, indirectly, but it was the beginning of the magazine that became The Advocate,
Oh,
which
wow.
grew out of a smaller thing. There was like this little newsletter that was printed. In fact, The Advocate started basically as a newsletter. So a lot came out of the Black Cat protests, which is why people on the West Coast say, we started the whole deal. You Stonewall people took it away from us. And that's just to wrap it up from this standpoint. That's when the Stonewall people come along and said, yes, but we actually started a movement and kept it going. You
Mm.
guys had a protest, yes, in Silver Lake in early March of 1967, but then it kind of petered out.
Yeah.
We kept it going in New York City. It just kept going and growing from there with the founding of the Gay Liberation Front and and then the Gay Activists Alliance, the GAA, were the two main organizations. And from then on, the movement was pretty well launched.
It's fascinating because it's also kind of not the same debate, but like right now, is LGBTQ representation on Broadway, like how different is it than Hollywood? Like, right, Hollywood has more visibility. So, like, you could make an argument that what Hollywood does with LGBTQ stories has more of an impact on Broadway, even though, you know, the Broadway audience is a lot of them are composed of the queer community. So, I don't know. It's interesting because it's kind of like Hollywood teaches the public, but Broadway is like an insider industry.
Broadway is much smaller. It's more elitist. It's New York centric, of course. And I know you're there in New Jersey, right? So you're close to New York City, and I was raised in New
Yeah.
Jersey, close to New York. So to me, I mean, I've always kind of, because I'm sort of a New York chauvinist, I've always been okay with Stonewall stealing the thunder, and but it was Broadway. Boy, it was so important to me as a kid. I grew up. I was like a teenager in the '60s and '70s, and I discovered New York. I discovered Broadway musicals, and I
Mhm.
don't know who told me that I was supposed to like Broadway musicals, but I discovered that and got hopped on the bus, and I got in to see Hello Dolly and Hair and
Oh,
Fiddler
well,
on the
there you
Roof.
go. Carol Channing, talk about a gay icon. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. Talk about yeah, it was, but it was Ginger Rogers. By the time I
Ginger
saw it, it was a
Rogers.
little
Yeah, you
later.
didn't see Carol
I
Channing.
didn't see Carol Channing. I actually saw Ginger Rogers. It was the
Wow.
first
Well,
Broadway
still.
show. Yeah, it was like middle school almost, but it was the first Broadway show I ever went to was Hello Dolly with
Yeah.
Ginger Rogers.
Yeah. Well, we're a friend of Dorothy, Richard. So, of course, we
Yes,
love
and that
Broadway
generation.
musicals.
Well, you're so much younger, but yes, I'm kind of. People didn't. I was a little bit after that. I was a little bit later than Stonewall, and um,
Yeah. Which,
but
again, people forget that Judy Garland died
oh
the
right,
same
yeah,
day as Stonewall, right? Because there's like a theory, there was like a much popularized myth that it was because of Judy Garland's death that the
the
first
Stonewall.
brick was thrown at Stonewall, which,
I think it was. I think her funeral was that
or her
day.
funeral, sorry, her
I think
funeral.
that it may be whatever. It matters not. It was something. There was a Judy Gar. I mean, maybe there was a tie-in. I think there were a number of factors, and many people have pointed out that Stonewall was not the first time that there were riots.
What does Sunset Boulevard, The Sound of Music, Vertigo, Snow White, The Wizard of Oz, and even Rebecca have in common? They've been covered on my friend Christian Garcia's podcast called That Old Gay Classic Cinema. Every time he is researching and deep diving a film with his guests, he asks the question, what's so queer about this film? You're going to love his podcast. You can listen to it on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and follow him on Instagram and TikTok at That Old Gay Classic Cinema. I hope you all enjoy it as much as I do. Mm,
um, in New York City, but it went on for days. That was part of it also. And Stonewall was not a particularly huge bar. It wasn't a particularly central, important, maybe centrally located though, because it was right there in the middle of Greenwich Village. So it really had a great location in Sheridan Square. So that actually is a factor.
mm,
But it's that they kept coming back
yeah.
night after night. So for 4 nights after June 28th, 1969, they kept coming back to protest. And the Mattachine Society morphed into the Gay Liberation Front, which then split, and you got the GAA, and
Mm,
that's kind of how it all started. And it wasn't going to end. It really had it, it really attracted a lot of people. And then it was only a year later that you had the first march, the first Gay Pride March was just to commemorate the Stonewall riots, and that's what sort of many Carter argues. David Carter argues, the late David Carter in this issue that was what really nailed Stonewall as the beginning. It was because the celebration of the 1 year anniversary of Stonewall happened right at the right time,
Mm.
for that. I have a letter to the editor in the next issue, which says, yes, but the movement was well established. It was going to happen. It wasn't just because of, the march or that. But I think it could be said that, yes, that's what nailed Stonewall as the key event that launched
Yeah.
the movement.
Everything lined up
Everything
for
lined up.
Stonewall. Yes. Like it's kind of like now there's been massive protests happening across the country in metropolitan areas. It's kind of just like what's the flashpoint for um mostly the public to take notice or for the media to take notice, right? Because the media, the mainstream media, does not like to, and that goes into specifically with the AIDS crisis. I was just watching Cheryl Lee Ralph talk about being in Dreamgirls in 1981 and starting advocacy with Elizabeth Taylor because she's like, my friends were dying, and no one was talking about this, and I couldn't believe how silent, it was. And like she started the actors benefit. I think it's called the actors benefit, which is like the longest running AIDS advocacy, HIV/AIDS
Oh,
advocacy for the Broadway community. Um, but it kind of reminds me now with Hands Off, and it's like eventually there's so much momentum that the mainstream media can't ignore what's going on in front of their eyes. Like they could have ignored Act Up at the beginning, but then eventually, how much longer can you ignore what's right in front of you, even if someone's telling you a narrative that's untrue?
yeah. I mean, again, my generation, I was sort of the tail end of the Vietnam War. So I'm old enough to have participated in some of the protests in the 70s. Um, and yeah, I mean, it was like it went on for years. Eventually, I think the protests are what brought the war to an end, but it took a lot. It took, I don't know if we have the patience this time around to go on for years, nor do I know what the flashpoint might be, but there could very well be one. I suspect it will be, an economic meltdown or something. Could be something like that. Might be something that the broad public would be likely to respond to, but who
Well,
knows?
yeah, but something else I want to know too is how much those readers of the Gay and Lesbian Review, the G&LR, how exciting it is always to see what the reviews are going to be. Like I know soon everyone's going to hear my episode with Brian Alessandro, who did an excellent review of the queer film by Luca Guadagnino, who did Call Me by Your Name, and then I've had Margaret Vandenberg on, so listen to that episode, everyone. She wrote a novel called Craze, which is all about ballroom culture of the Harlem Renaissance. So I love what happens in the reviews. Like I love how the way that we got aligned in the universe. My belief, Richard, is that the mission of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room is the same alignment of the mission of the G&LR, which is like we're not going to ignore pop culture. We're not going to ignore what some in academia might have deemed lowbrow. We're going to connect these communities together, both the high and the lowbrow art forms.
Oh, sure. I love pop culture, and we cover pop culture. I mean, I think popular culture is extremely important, and so we're not like a kind of snooty magazine that only
Yes.
covers like opera or something very extremely, highbrow at all. I mean, I think popular culture is in a way more important, really, because of the numbers of people who are involved and who are influenced by it. So yeah, absolutely.
Well,
Popular
and I
culture.
hope you and Steven take this as a compliment, but anytime I tell my fiance Lawrence that I'm doing something with the GNLR, he's like, "Oh, you're talking to the modern day Truman Capote men." I
I
was
guess
like,
I hope I don't talk like Truman Capote.
"No, but you have the literati skills and prowess of Truman Capote,
Well,
Richard."
he was a great writer, yeah, no doubt about it. He was a weird guy.
Yes, yes.
Talk
But
about
I
somebody
think
who the word
for,
queer
yes,
applies.
for Lawrence, he always, and that's something that I think is so incredible about your magazine is how it's bringing in younger voices. Like there's such an intergenerational feel now. And I think that's so important because,
Yes, more so, I think. I think it's
yeah,
happening more so. And,
yeah.
because I'm no spring chicken at this point. So, I'm going to have to step aside
Well, I'm not
and
saying
make
that,
way
Richard,
for.
but
No, no, but it's true though. And it's true. And I'm not announcing this as anything in particular, but I am really planning to sort of step aside at some point, in not too distant future, and make way for younger people. So, I don't know if you've spoken to Allison Armijo, who is our web editor, and
mm,
who I think is bringing a younger voice and a younger energy to our website.
yes, we
Um,
do a lot on Instagram together. So,
oh, you do, yeah.
yes, anytime
So
there's an Instagram or a TikTok, I've, talked with her that I definitely think, um, I don't know, something I think would be cool, Richard, and I'm just going to air this on the podcast because why not? Maybe others will want to jump behind this. Is I think it could be awesome to have a GNLR and ITBR like social party or some kind of like, have you ever done a magazine event where like people come to an afternoon and with like cocktails and hors d'oeuvres? Because that could be really cool to meet each other.
yes, I mean we're a national magazine, and we're here in Boston,
Yeah.
which is kind of not New York, not LA, but Boston's kind of still a key city, and it's a great city for this kind of thing. And so yes, we have actually, in fact, we have an annual party. We have an annual holiday party in early December every year, which is a way for, let's see, for our local writers, local donors, because we're a nonprofit organization, and everybody else, as well as personal friends, I suppose. But anybody who's involved in the magazine in an editorial way, or our proofreaders, and everybody comes to that. But that's just a social event. It's an evening thing, and we have actually had a couple of social events that are more broad based, but only here in Boston, I believe. Well, no, actually, we have long years and years ago. We had something. We did something in New York City. So
Well,
we've tried that.
we'll touch base again, Richard, because I'm
Yeah,
already
that'd be
coming
fun.
up with an idea for next year, like next spring, because I need some time to plan it. But I can bring on some guests from the podcast. You
Okay.
can bring some writers, and then I have friends who Dawn, shout out to Pen and Brush, which is a feminist and queer art gallery in Chelsea, and I've done events there. Maybe we can all bring ourselves together and have like a social event. So
And this is like in New York,
in
probably.
New York. Hmm.
Yeah, New York. I mean, New
Oh,
York is,
yeah.
yes, New York is
I
great.
love Boston. I love Boston.
I do
Definitely not putting
too.
down
This is
Boston.
where we are. We were founded. We started out as the Harvard Gay and Lesbian Review, and so there's still a kind of Harvard, little bit of a vestigial Harvard connection, I suppose. But we're a national organization, and
Yeah,
so
but New York has that lightning rod.
we, oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at if I just were to do a search right now of where our writers came from, New York dominates. Even though I think California dominates in terms of the number of subscribers, and LA certainly is huge. But New York, in terms of our writers, it's huge. New York is a dominant force.
Okay, well, we'll return to this and release it to the listeners
Yeah,
when we have more plans. But I definitely think there's some kind of really cool art event we could do. Okay,
yeah, great.
but can you tease us all? So, what is the magazine that has now just hit the shelves, the May and June magazine?
Yeah, so
Yeah, what does it look like?
it looks
Oh,
like
it's pretty.
this. Yeah, this it's got sort of a montage, I guess you'd call that, on the cover, because it's about this one is very theme focused, and importantly, it's guest edited. So I did not edit this issue, or at least the feature articles. The rest of it I did. But the guest editor is Jonathan D. Katz, who is
Ah,
an art critic and historian and curator. And he has curated an exhibition which is called The First Homosexuals, The Birth of an Identity, 1869 to 1939. So that gives you kind of the sweep of time that he's dealing with. And he's covering precisely that era that started in Germany in the late 19th century, where the word homosexual was first coined. But he is tracing the impact of that coinage on the visual arts
Hmm.
and how the notion that there were these new people called homosexuals or Uranians or Uranians or whatever were suddenly with us, and his argument and the argument that I think is made by the exhibition itself is that this concept did kind of penetrate into the art world and showed up on the canvases of artists during that period.
Hmm.
And I think he makes a very convincing case, as you'll see. So this issue includes, I think, a total of 7 writers, art historians, who contributed to the catalog, which is a very large, thick catalog for this exhibit, which opens in Chicago on May 2nd.
Wow. Okay.
So it's coming up. Stephen and I are going out there in a couple of weeks or quite soon. What, sweetie? Greta, no barking. Um,
His dog.
yeah, that was Greta.
Oh,
And
how long is this running, Richard?
until July 26th, I think. I think it goes from May 2nd until, um, let's see, his little introduction might be the best place to look, until July 26th. And it is at museum. It's at a museum called the Wrightwood 659, which I
Hmm.
think also tells you its address. I think it's at 659
Oh,
Wrightwood
okay.
Street or Avenue.
So anyone who's in the Chicago area or planning to go to Chicago this summer, definitely. Now I'm gonna even look up quickly hotels and
Yeah, May, June, and
flights.
July, basically. So you've got three
May, June,
months.
and July. Okay.
Yeah, so it's got a good long run, and it's huge. It includes, I think, 300 works that he gathered from around the world. Um,
Wow.
and yeah, so it's got this.
Well, I
Yeah,
think I was just gonna say, Richard, I think we've figured out who I'm going to be interviewing for May and June's issue, which is talking to Jonathan.
if you
Uh,
can get, yes, I think Jonathan D. Katz would be, well, he would be a great person to interview. He's brilliant. He's totally incredibly smart. I should be so smart, and he will give you a great interview. And he'll probably talk about some of these contributors. I think he would be in a better position than I, although I got to know these 7 because of their articles in this issue, each very, very different. And it has an international flavor. So actually, I pointed out, so in this issue, you've got somebody who's writing about this era, this 60-year period, whatever it is: Japan, Russia, Canada, Argentina, Paris or France, and India. And then
wow.
there's another article that's not geographically specific, but the other articles are, and so you get a flavor of the international character of this exhibition. And I think it's quite amazing what Jonathan has done.
Yeah. This is incredibly exciting. I can't wait to get
Yeah,
my copy. It's probably in my mailbox. Um, everyone out there, glreview.org. I will be back again with an interview with Brian Alessandro to talk about Queer and his novel, Queer the film. Definitely, I will be reaching out to Jonathan about his exhibition, The First Homosexuals. And I can't wait to hear, Richard, what you and Stephen think about it when you go to Chicago. So, off air, I'm going to see. Oh, you're going soon, but we'll figure it out. If I end up seeing it, I'll definitely make sure we share our thoughts about our favorite pieces. But Richard, this was wonderful. I think
yeah,
this
this
was
was
so
fun.
exciting to hear about like how you put together the when did the LGBT movement begin encore issue and just like bringing us through all these decades of history is centuries actually is so important. So there's a promo code for everyone out there if you don't have the G&LR ITBR choice. You go to the subscription section on the website, put in that code, and you'll get a free issue. So you could like choose the May and June issue as your free issue. And I always recommend the print edition just because I love a print magazine, but the online edition I know is really popular. It's incredibly well done. And make sure you follow their Instagram, the GL Review. And I think that's it. Anything else, Richard, you want to bring here on the air?
No, I just want to thank you so much for this opportunity and for your ongoing support for the magazine,
Of course.
which has been wonderful. And we look forward to continuing our collaboration. And I hope we do a social event or some kind of literary event.
That would be
We'll be at
fun.
the Rainbow Book Fair this year, I think is in early May. So some of us will be down there, I think. Check out,
Oh, yes.
um,
Go to the Rainbow Book Fair if you're
just
in New
look for
York
their
City.
website and find out exactly. I don't know the exact date, I forget. And I don't know if we can actually be there ourselves, but I think some representative from our organization will be there, hawking magazines and subscriptions. And
Okay.
yeah, so check it out and definitely come to our website, glreview.org.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you, Richard. And bye to
Thank you,
everyone
Andrew.
out there.
Okay.